I was on the phone this morning with a good friend of mine. Um, we've both been Muslim, oh, probably somewhere around like the 30-year mark or getting close to there. And we were talking about the importance that culture plays, um, and that one thing that can happen in becoming Muslim, um, at least here in the States in our experience, is that there can be a losing of oneself. But also, I have noticed in the last several years, there's been kind of a demonization of culture, as if culture in itself is a bad thing. And in the course of our conversation, I kind of reflected on the idea that culture is the repository of morality and of character. I'm not saying the originator, but the repository. Of course, for at least for us as Muslims, we do believe in the existence of an objective morality, meaning the morality that the Quran espouses, the morality that is articulated by the Prophet ﷺ, that is an objective morality. Nonetheless, over time there needs to be repositories for these characteristics and these values. They cannot reside alone in books and in tomes, or even only in esteemed teachers. Like, of course, it's hopefully, it's kind of like my job, but realistically, there are, I'm certainly not any paragon of ultimate morality, and therefore teachers themselves even can't. It's something that is carried within the broader genius of a community. And, there's an oft repeated verse from Surah Al-Hujurat in the 13th verse where God says, Ya ayyuhan nas, calling people's attention, oh people, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, right? That we created you from a single man and woman. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا, right? And that we fashioned you, right, into shu'uban and qaba'ila, right? Sometimes it's translated as nations and tribes. Like a sha'ab is a people, and a qabila, also kind of like a people, right? And lita'arafu, to mutually know one another. Well, the only way that you can be known, right, is to be distinct. And the only way to know someone else is to have some reference and point of departure. So therefore, you also have to be distinct. And therefore, that distinction, again, will kind of be the role and the function of culture. And this then, of course, makes it somewhat problematic today if culture is demonized. And along with that is the idea that, privilege is demonized and so on and so on. There was an interesting article in the New York Times that was written about the recent scandal about entrance into college. And of course, people paying to get in is undoubtedly, immoral, wrong, unethical, so on and so forth. But then the person in the article kind of went even further and was sort of impugning people for essentially just having money. And it's like, well, is money the problem, or is using money or some other currency of influence to get which isn't earned in a situation that demands merit? Is that the problem, or do we just have some problem with money, right? Because money being some sort of stand-in for privilege. And in our conversation, we were saying that one of the things you can lose, it can sometimes happen with people who become Muslim. You lose You either lose of your own, of your own choosing, or sometimes coerced, or a combination of the two. You lose a sense of self. And the friend of mine is a white convert, and when she and I were talking, I was like, the goal should not be that a person has to give up their whiteness. And I know that this will be very uncomfortable in the current climate of discussions in our community about whiteness and so on. And I'm not trying to whitewash history. I mean, trust me, there were some heinous things that were done by white Western culture, undoubtedly. And it's not to downplay those. However, that is not the totality of white culture, and not every white culture is, colonization and so on and so on. And most importantly, for a person that just kind of stumbles into this life like the rest of us, and then becomes Muslim, what can sometimes happen is a person can become so inordinately caught up in abandoning culture that, as I've been talking in these other videos about morality, and as we've been, studying in the Saturday class, Islam in Depth, about morality, well, if we get rid of culture, or some people get rid of their culture, and culture is, again, the repository of morality, character, virtue, then how are we going to have any of those? Also, how can we then redeem a culture? Because the Prophet ﷺ did not come and obliterate Arab culture, even though what they were doing at the time that the revelation came down was also equally repugnant. Wanton violence and war, oppression of women, bearing of infant daughters, and so on and so on. And yet it was to refine and then hopefully make use of those good aspects of culture that would then go on to be the repositories and the carriers of those great values, right? Of, belief and so on. So, sometimes, culture today gets really, it tries to get knocked down a peg, and people talk about cultural Islam and whatnot. Well, culture can become tyrannical, and it can become predatory. So, I'm not interested in giving up, my culture. That's why I never changed my name after all these years, and obviously the way that I dress and the food that I like to eat and so on and so on. But, if we are going to develop a viable alternative, right? So I think that, this is another area we need to do some thinking and strategizing and planning on. And as I mentioned in another video that I saw, like when I lived in Philadelphia, right? There was a kind of microcosm of like Muslimness, of like, we're Muslim and we ain't really too bothered about what the dominant culture thinks of us. And in fact, after having gotten down to the business of just being Muslim, the dominant culture actually seems to be pretty cool with it. My wife at the time, when we were living in Philadelphia, expressed how, some other problems aside, it certainly was a very comfortable place to be Muslim in. Our elderly neighbor, we lived in the Italian market, and which was full of, at that time, either there was like a Southeast Asian, like Cambodian, Laotian, but then of course there was a lot of older white Italian, which sometimes, maybe in some other places, as a person of color or as a Muslim or some other sort of like non-majority type of, group characteristic, you might be a little bit nervous about being so overtly Muslim in that situation. And yet, because the Muslims had so normalized Islam to the non-Muslims, even shortly after 9/11, it was like, business as usual. And that's always given me a ray of hope that, we have that potential to do that, elsewhere. So, something to consider that when, been talking about morality, well, morality cannot exist as an abstract, and it cannot just simply exist in books from the past, nor can it only reside within a few elite pious people, right? It has to be seated in the culture. And as Allah Ta'ala has said, right, He has created us to be of two types, both of which a cultured people. A sha'ab and a qabila, right, to be a people, so that we can lita'arafu, so that we can mutually know one another, but we need to have a point of departure. And other people, we should also want to be distinctly them. We should not be culturally either hostile or predatory, because when people are, I guess you could say, culturally ensconced or rooted, then they are knowable. And that's good. That's a good place, and also for our kids, I think that will also, for the younger generation of Muslims, for future generations of Muslims, I think that will go a long way to helping them fully idkhulu fi salmi kafa, right? Fully embracing Islam, because now it is something that is seeping into, it's seeping into our pores, into our DNA, it's seeping into the subconscious, and inshallah being, just being genuine. So something to consider. Inshallah, we'll probably get into some more of this in the morning. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.